May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Geek Audio podcast. More Tassajara Stories. I'm DC Poopa of Geek Audio and Geek Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable and free from economic hardship and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. Today's, we've got 3 pieces for the work in progress, Tassajara Stories. The early years with Shunryu Suzuki. So, first, we'll have our pause to meditate. So when the bell rings, if you're of a mind, hit pause and meditate or whatever for as long as you want. And when you're through, hit unpause. And we'll all come back at the same time and hit the bell to end the meditation or whatever. Eggink. Once on my way back into Tassajara, stopped at Lambert's, and he told me there was a man on his way who wanted to take his baby boar hunting. Marion thought that was not right, but Bill didn't want to turn down business, and they were going to stay 2 nights in the guest room. The guest was late, finally showed up walking. He'd taken the dirt road up the mountain a ways to try to go see Tassajara first, and had driven over a rock that had taken out his oil pan. He was a tall guy, carried a baby. Good Lord, how old was that baby? Like less than a year. Boar hunting? Rough country. God. So he sat down and Marion gave him something to eat. He and Lambert hit it off right away. And then I got his name. A name I knew well. Daniel Eggink. Wow, good to meet you. I'd heard about Daniel for years. He was one of the Minnesota crowd that came to Zen Center. He went off just after the time that I arrived, and I never got to know him. But he made an impression. Tall, sure of himself, he was the first person to shave his head at Zen Center. Fellow Minnesotan Loring was the second. Maybe they were the only 2 before Tassajara. It was Daniel who turned Loring on to Zen macrobiotics. Came over to his apartment in the city and dropped a 100-pound bag of brown rice on him. And the thing that really bonded them at first was their love of psychedelics. And later, their love of Shunryu Suzuki and Zazen. Daniel was a total wild man. Had been an early acid head, had given unsuspecting Suzuki a hash brownie at a party. Suzuki's comment on it later was, bang, bang, crash, crash. Maybe it made noise louder for him. Loring said Daniel got a serious concussion when the car he was sleeping in on the side of the highway in Big Sur was smashed into by a drunk driver. He and his wife Cynthia had land in Montana where they started a commune. That's the commune of nudity and guns fame that Rouvain had stumbled on, which led to Daniel sending him to study with Suzuki. Daniel and Belle kept one-upping each other with outlandish stories and got so into it that night they stripped naked in the kitchen to compare scars. He said his spiritual path had led to other places, but that practicing with Suzuki had awakened his way-seeking mind, a term that Suzuki had often used. Daniel said, kindness was what I felt in the presence of Shunryu Suzuki, and it was a kindness I didn't have. Even now, when I see him in my mind's eye, I am humbled by his example. Squeaky. Suzuki asked Diane if she was missing Margaret, who'd been in the city, and she said she missed her a lot. He said he should keep them apart, but it was too painful for him to do so. A number of times he said that he was not a good teacher for Diane, that he treated her too much like his granddaughter and not like a student. He told Silas in the city to let Margaret come down and suggested Diane call her to let her know. Margaret did come for the summer, and that worked out fine. They'd grown up some and weren't disruptive. Diane found a baby hummingbird on the ground. She was living in the dorm and put it in the window in a little box, fed it sugar and water, and called it Squeaky. It only lasted a few days. She came to me crying, and I tried to comfort her. Still crying, she found Suzuki in his garden. He was most sympathetic. She asked him, where did Squeaky go? He said he didn't know. Diane hadn't been feeling good for a couple of weeks. She had an ache in her abdomen that got worse and worse. She was working with me in the dining room, and finally I had to tell her to go stay in bed. Suzuki was giving talks, and she got too sick to go into the Zendo, so she sat on a chair outside. The next talk, she was in too much pain to even do that and returned to her room. Some people urged her to go see Dr. Winter. Others told her to stay away from Western medicine, take some herbs, keep fasting, and it would be healed. She'd been partially fasting for weeks and totally for days. Suzuki was concerned. I was concerned. We all should have been more concerned. Another example of us not dealing well with an important situation. A young community without a lot of experienced seniors in a time of great mistrust of authority and the norm. However, there was enough trust of Bill Winter to tip the scales. He was called, and he insisted she be brought to the hospital immediately. She went into surgery. Winter, the surgeon, he discovered an abscess on her right fallopian tube and intestine. It was the size of a cantaloupe, and it broke during the operation. She was in the hospital for 5 days and then recuperated at Winter's for over a week, all free of charge, thanks to Bill Winter. I visited her at the Winters on a day off. Diane said Suzuki had come to the hospital and that she'd been pretty out of it on the combination of the prior fasting and morphine. When he came into the room, she said, I was there but not there. I was on a cliff, and there were large birds flying around me, and I was feeling them fly, and then I saw Suzuki Roshi at the door, and he walked in and said hello, and I came back to see him. He sort of played with me for 10 minutes, and then Oksan said they should go, and he said to come back soon to Tassajara. Bill Winter told me that Diane would have died if we'd waited any longer to bring her in. He said that we had to have somebody there with medical training and some authority. Another student had almost died from an illness. People were accusing him behind his back of slacking off when he kept staying in bed. When he got a fever, that stopped. When his temperature went to 106 one night, we realized he was on the verge and got him to the hospital. Bill said not to wait that long to act. He urged us to rest more, especially when a flu set in, saying that trying to keep working with a flu prolongs it. And he told us to keep resting till the flu had gone for 3 days. He also said that people should rest after a head injury. Bill Laws was somewhat older and had sobering stories of studying Rinzai Zen in Japan, where he'd seen novice monks thrown off the deck while in full lotus. He suffered malnutrition from the diet, which he said gave the abbot and the abbot's 2 main disciples stomach cancer. Finally, he found a way to continue studying with the abbot. He moved to a nearby apartment and came to the temple for Zazen and Sanzen, which is Rinzai for Doksan. Bill and I were among students planting pine trees. We'd dig a hole with a pick and shovel, then put in the sapling with a stake and pound it in with a small sledge, and sometimes whacking with the flat blade of the shovel. I was squatting down, holding the stake, when Bill came down hard on it with the shovel, which slid off the stake to bring the side of the shovel smashing into the top of my head and cutting a gouge in it. About knocked me out. He helped me up and walked me back to the center, sporting my blood-soaked face and once white T-shirt. Freaked people out. I loved it. I was washed off and put straight to bed. Winter was called. He said someone should stay with me a while and not let me go to sleep. Katagiri was there and came to visit. I apologized to him for being so out of it and babbling. Jerry Fuller was sitting with me and said that was nothing unusual for me. I got to stay in bed for the rest of the day and the next and got some good reading done. The pine trees didn't do well. It was decided not to water them so that the strong would survive. They all died. After one injury, there was no question about taking me to the hospital right away. We were cutting up a tree that had fallen in the creek. I was handing up segments to someone on top of the stone retaining wall by the dining room deck. I was passing up a heavy log that was cut at an angle. It was so heavy I could hardly lift it. It slipped out of the hands of the person up top, and the sharp end came smashing down like a pile driver onto the top of my foot, protected only by the thinness of a rubber boot. I fell down and went into shock. They carried me up Kabarga Creek under the bridge and onto the bench of the bridge where I lay down. Diane was doing grounds then, and she brought a vehicle in to get me and drove me to town, as we all assumed that my numb foot had multiple broken bones. On the way out, we saw an ambulance take off from the meadow where the national park begins. Stopped by Dr. Winter's house in the valley to see if he was there. His wife, Peggy, answered the door, came to the car and said that Bill was in surgery. A podiatrist was waiting to check me out, and I could be in surgery right away. Then she gave Diane and me a big toke off a hash pipe. The podiatrist gently slipped my rubber boot off, felt my foot, went, took an x-ray, and reported that there was nothing broken. Maybe some tendon damage. I couldn't believe it. He said that the top of the foot and the back of the hand can take enormous blows, thanks to evolution. I learned from him his prior client was the man in the ambulance that had come off the Tassajara Road. He just accidentally shot himself in the foot with a .45. Was lucky not to lose his foot. Whew. Diane and I spent that evening with the Winters. Bill was so generous to us. He always called Tassajara Tass. Barbecue outside with cocktails and pot beforehand, and then some pot after. Peggy was a nurse and Bill's second wife, and that was his hippie marriage. But he was no hippie. Bill was president of the County Medical Association. He came across as straight and conventional. People didn't realize that he and his teenage sons took acid together. He was also the person who was contacted when someone was having a bad trip. His policy was not to use tranquilizers to bring people down, said that tended to leave them worse off than letting it run its course. The main problem, he said, was other people's alarm and bad vibes. He told a woman whose husband had accidentally taken LSD not to bring him to the hospital, but take him to a nice scenic spot with no one to bother them, sit under a tree, show no concern, and let him ride it out. Stan. Once when there was no one available to drive Suzuki to Tassajara, he said he'd take a bus. He was told they'd get him a ride, but he said, no, don't, that he wanted to take the bus. The town trip would pick him up. Stan White and Ed Brown, who had some personal errands to do, went in early with the Dodge truck and were waiting for Suzuki when he got off the bus in the afternoon. On the way back, they got a load of sand for cement. Suzuki picked up some sand, let it run through his fingers, looked over at Ed and said, "Cook this up for breakfast." That got the three of them laughing. Stan said he liked to laugh, and his laugh was full. Stan and I were sitting in the dining room, just the two of us talking and drinking tea. I said, "How dainty you are with your cup." "That's one thing you never forget from being raised in a rich family," he said. Suzuki Roshi once said to me, "You have an awful lot of manners." Stan always paraphrased what Suzuki said, putting it in his own vernacular, and sometimes, to my mind, adding what he felt was implied. Dan grew up in Boston, had gone to private schools where his studies included Roman and Greek. After he returned from World War II, his uncle arranged for him to be president of a small bank. He said he'd rather go to art school and study portrait painting. His father said he could do that, but he'd be forfeiting his inheritance. They shook on it. The erudite side of Stan, though, wasn't easy to see, and he didn't talk about it except once to me. He said that his sister sent him enough to get by on, but wouldn't support his children. Children? He'd never before mentioned marriage or children. In his earliest days at San Francisco, he was a bearded bohemian character in North Beach called Sebastian. He had stories about the beats and street people. Some of them were salacious, including what he had to say about Janis Joplin. He was frank and could make unflattering comments as well as praise about others. He got a job keeping books and doing office work for Silas's importing business. Silas and Claude were the two people I'd see him talking to the most comfortably. They were older than most of us and a decade younger than Stan. Sometimes Tassajara was difficult for me. Basically, the sitting and, frankly, the students, he said. I was a lot older than everybody there, and the kids were talking a lot about the Vietnam War, and I'd already been in 2 wars, and they'd say how they wouldn't fight, and that was foreign to me. And when I mentioned that I'd been in war, they kind of disliked me, and I felt isolated. I was the only veteran there since Bob Watkins left. Surely Stan didn't feel that way all the time, and I don't think most people judged and disliked him either. He could get grouchy, but mainly I'd say he was respected and accepted. He did his work well and followed the schedule. He was confident and a good storyteller. He had a group of young students enthralled with stories of working around carnivals. He said he started off selling souvenirs, balloons, pens, and said you could tell men who'd bought his pens because they had ink stains on their shirt. He said the attitude there was to regard customers as suckers and see what you could get out of them. Maybe it was Tim Aston told me those students were the suckers, that Stan's carnival stories happened to be awfully close to ones in a book he'd read by, can't remember, Philip Roth comes to mind. Stan said, Paul Disco asked me if I could drive a truck, and I said, hell, I've driven Jeeps through Korea. I did the town trips, which eventually led me to being in the office and doing the books, and Silas liked that because I'd kept his books carefully, and then Tatsugami Roshi came, and I became Foos, the treasurer. I had a title and was in charge of the guests, which I really loved because I'm kind of people-oriented. The students I had a hard time with because everybody seemed to be bucking for something, and I wanted to get rid of my suffering. I had a lot of problems, and I wanted to get rid of them, but I was just seeing them better. Besides the pain in my body during Zazen, I saw the pain in my relationships to people. Stan didn't like to be told what to do by younger whippersnappers. That didn't come up much because right from the first he had his own area, shopping or office and guests. Summer came. Reb was in the office, and Stan asked him to come up with a schedule for the office staff. Reb included Stan in the schedule, and when he told Stan it was his time to work there, Stan said, no, it's not. You're not in charge of scheduling anymore. Stan was feeling high after a session and wanted to show his appreciation to Suzuki, so on a town trip he went to the Japanese market in Monterey and bought not the usual common bancha, but some very fine and expensive green tea. He called it ocha, with the twisted leaves. Suzuki was genuinely appreciative and invited him in to have some, but then the bell for service hit, so he said another time. The other time didn't come up, but Stan remembered how pleased Suzuki was to get that tea, so he bought more and presented it to Suzuki, who received it, said a perfunctory thanks, but didn't invite Stan in. At Chosan morning tea with the officers, when the Ansha was starting to make tea, Stan pushed the tea canister he'd bought over to her to use. Suzuki growled, no, use bancha. Monks don't drink that tea. When Chosan was over, Stan said, I walked away feeling like Art Crumb's bent-over guy. I felt so low. I feel in order to learn Zen from a Zen teacher, it's good if they whack you. Stan was the heaviest smoker I've ever known. One thing that has puzzled addiction experts is how smokers will not get urges to smoke when they sleep. Stan said he would wake up and smoke a couple of times during the night. He'd smoke 3 cigarettes before the first morning zazen. He'd smoke during the walking keening between sitting periods. Every one of them, including just about every keening in a week-long session. He went to Suzuki once because he felt bad about how much he was smoking. Suzuki said he could smoke, but please don't do it around him, because he didn't like the smell. He did Sumi ink drawings with humorous Zen themes. Their settings seemed to be someplace that was a cross of Tassajara in China or Japan, often peopled with young or grizzled old monks, some resembling Bodhidharma. Some had captions split into 2 parts for dramatic effect. One featured a monk with a large belly that read, "Simple vegetarian cuisine, agrees with the monks." Some were touching, such as one with a young monk on a path with staff in hand, looking up a steep mountain, with words brushed on the left side reading, "Good luck on the journey ahead." One had a monk sitting with hands out imploring the age-old, "Who is it who sits zazen?" He put cards in the outgoing mail I wanted to photograph for their artistry and unique penmanship. Envelopes, too. I asked him, please let me see any letter he wrote before sending it. They'd usually have more art than words. Stan didn't go on hikes with Suzuki or try to be close to him. He said, "I don't like to be with him in crowds because everybody was always climbing all over him, and I would think, give the poor man a little space." There's a difficulty in being a respected leader with people wanting your presence all the time. Stan thought Suzuki should be left alone to rest more. He was not a well man. My feeling is that during the war there was so much deprivation that he was malnourished, and I feel the same about Kobun. Stan said, Suzuki Roshi called the stomach a tummy. I had a hard time following a lot of his lectures, and one day he said, "You probably had a hard time understanding what I said, but someday you will." I thought, well, that's good enough. With Zen practice, you begin to understand the process is enjoyable. I chant in Japanese and can feel the vibration and hear the sound in a vast ocean of no sound. And it's an interesting practice to chant these things. But in the lectures, he would explain Chikudo and my eyelids would droop, or I'd get sleepy, or my body would hurt so much from sitting cross-legged that I wouldn't pay too much attention. And when I did, it was more to how he was sitting, his demeanor and his presence. He looked quiet and comfortable, talking up there, dressed with his nice robe on. He looked lovely, and he wasn't slumped over. He did cough a lot, but that had nothing to do with his presence. Suzuki Roshi had presence. People yakety yak, but people do notice presence. If you're strong where you are, people will respect you. And not only respect you, but they'll ask you to teach them how to do that. And this is definitely what Suzuki Roshi had. When he talks, people listen, like the ad says. Presence is really important, and that's what Suzuki Roshi had a lot of. And because of that, he was revered. Where do you think that power comes from, that he is able to, out of nowhere, do the things he does? Tatsugami Roshi, same thing, presence. Kobun and Katagiri Sensei and Bill Kwong and Richard Baker, God bless him, presence. They got it through their practice. In Doksan, Stan told Suzuki, Here he was at Tassajara, 50 years old, and expressed concern about his future. What am I going to do? Suzuki told him not to worry, that he'd get ordained. Stan was delighted and said he was ready. Suzuki said, when we're ready. Stan went to Boston because his mother was seriously hurt in an automobile accident. When he returned, he met with Suzuki in the city. Suzuki asked him how he was doing, and he said he was fine, but that he'd had enough, and said he wasn't going to go back to Tassajara. He'd brought his belongings with him when he left. Suzuki asked him how he liked Tatsugami. Stan said he thought Tatsugami was great, but for him the scene was too competitive. He knew that some sort of order was necessary, but he didn't want to get caught up in the who's going to be head dishwasher game. Stan left and went to Mexico. Stan said, it says in the sutra that all things are caused to attain complete unbounded liberation. There's no other meaning to this life. Suzuki Roshi was nationally, racially, and religiously blind. He once told me, I'm a very impatient man. I also am impatient to see a lot of people on the path. His inimitable way was very lovable. He turned me on and made my life enjoyable. For that, I really hope that his teaching spreads. This has been another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Booba of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from sleepy Sanur with Dogette Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.